we think we know the Second World War. We see the big pictures, the landings in Normandy, the brutal fight for Stalingrad, the naval clashes at Midway. These are the stories told in movies and taught in schools. They are important, they are monumental, but they are not the whole story. The war was a sprawling global conflict fought in forgotten places. It was decided by battles you have likely never heard of. What if the key to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a forgotten border skirmish in Mongolia a year earlier? What if the independence of modern Syria and Lebanon was decided by Australian soldiers fighting on a tennis court? And what if the final border of Russia was drawn in a battle fought 3 days after the war officially ended? History is not a clean narrative. It is a messy collection of events, choices, and consequences. The borders we see on our maps today were often drawn in blood, in muddy fields and frozen forests, far from the famous fronts. These lesser-known struggles were not sideshows. They were pivot points. They determined which empires would fall, which nations would be born, and where the lines of the Cold War would be drawn. This is the story of 17 of those fights. They were crucial, and they changed the world. Number 17. What if the war's final border was drawn after the surrender? The Battle of Shamshu was a strange and brutal footnote to a global war. The world was celebrating. The Japanese emperor had announced the surrender on August 15th, 1945. The papers were signed. But on the foggy volcanic island of Shamshu, the northernmost of the Kuril Islands, the fighting was just beginning. On August 18th, 3 days after the surrender broadcast, Soviet forces launched an amphibious invasion. The operation was part of the larger Soviet invasion of Manchuria, a campaign that had shattered the Japanese Kwantung Army in a matter of days. Joseph Stalin wanted the Kuril Islands. The Yalta Conference had promised them to him, but he wanted to take them by force to solidify his claim. It was a land grab, pure and simple. The Soviet commanders expected a quick victory. They assumed the Japanese garrison, numbering around 8,500 men, would be demoralized and ready to capitulate. They were wrong. The Japanese forces on Shamshu were well entrenched, well led by Lieutenant General Fusaki Tsutsumi, and they had not received clear orders to stand down. When the Soviet landing craft hit the beaches, they were met with ferocious resistance. The initial Soviet landing was a disaster. Fog concealed the coastline, and many ships ran aground on reefs. The Japanese defenders opened up with coastal artillery and machine guns, turning the landing zones into a killing field. Soviet naval infantry were cut down in the water. One historian, David Glantz, in his book, The Soviet Strategic Offensive in Manchuria, 1945, details the chaos of the landing. The Soviets had poor intelligence and almost no air support. It was a frontal assault against a prepared enemy. But the Soviets had numbers. They threw more and more men ashore. The fighting was savage, often hand-to-hand. The Japanese used their network of bunkers and tunnels to great effect. They launched counterattacks with their tanks, nearly pushing the invaders back into the sea. The key moment came when Soviet reinforcements finally managed to establish a secure beachhead and bring their own artillery to bear. For 4 days, the battle raged. Finally, on August 23rd, with their command structure in tatters and Tokyo confirming the surrender orders, the remaining Japanese forces laid down their arms. The cost was high. The Soviets lost over 1,500 men killed or wounded. The Japanese lost over 1,000. It was one of the deadliest single engagements of the short Soviet-Japanese conflict. Why was it so crucial? Because it directly reshaped the map. The Soviet Union's forceful seizure of Shamshu and the rest of the Kuril Islands established a physical reality that diplomacy has never overcome. Japan still contests the ownership of the Southern Kurils, which they call the Northern Territories. This dispute has prevented the two nations from ever signing a formal peace treaty to end World War II. The border drawn by the blood shed on Shamshu's beaches in August 1945 remains a point of international tension to this day. It is a direct legacy of a battle fought when the rest of the world thought the war was over. It is unsettling. How much did local Soviet commanders know about the official surrender, and did they push the attack for personal glory? Were there renegade Japanese officers who refused to obey the emperor's order, prolonging the bloodshed? And what secret communications passed between the isolated Japanese garrison and Tokyo in those chaotic days, messages that might explain why they fought so hard for a war that was already lost? Number 16, could Australian soldiers on a tennis court decide the fate of the Middle East? In June 1941, the war came to a very strange place, a tennis court in Beirut. The battle fought there and across Syria and Lebanon is one of the most bizarre and overlooked campaigns of the entire conflict. It pitted allies against allies, and its outcome created the modern map of the Middle East. After the fall of France in 1940, its colonial empire was split. Some parts joined Charles de Gaulle's Free French forces. Others, like the territories of Syria and Lebanon, remained loyal to the collaborationist Vichy regime. This created a huge problem for the British. Syria and Lebanon sat at a strategic crossroads, bordering Turkey, British-controlled Palestine, and oil-rich Iraq. If German forces gained a foothold there, they could threaten the Suez Canal and the entire British position in the region. In May 1941, that fear became a reality. German and Italian aircraft staging through Syrian airfields assisted a pro-German coup in Iraq. The British put down the Iraqi revolt, but realized they had to act. They had to take Syria and Lebanon from the Vichy French. The mission, codenamed Operation Exporter, was a messy affair. The invasion force was a mix of British, Australian, Indian, and, most awkwardly, Free French soldiers. They were about to invade and fight their own countrymen. The campaign was supposed to be a walkover. The British High Command, as documented by authors like Gavin Long in Australia in the War of 1939 to 1945, grossly underestimated the Vichy French. They assumed the defenders would put up a token fight and then switch sides. They were wrong. The Vichy commander, General Henri Dentz, commanded a formidable force of around 35,000 colonial troops. They were well equipped and determined to defend French honor. The fighting was bitter. The Australian 7th Division pushed up the coast towards Beirut. The terrain was difficult, and the Vichy defenders were skilled. One of the most symbolic fights took place at the Litani River, where Australian infantry fought a desperate battle against well-defended positions. But the strangest fight was for Beirut itself. In one part of the city, Australian soldiers found themselves fighting Vichy troops for control of a fortified position centered on a local tennis club. The image of deadly combat taking place on the pristine clay courts captured the surreal nature of the campaign. After a month of hard fighting, the Allies prevailed. An armistice was signed on July 14, 1941. The campaign cost the Allies around 4,600 casualties. The Vichy French lost over 6,000. It was a bloody, fratricidal conflict that many preferred to forget. But its consequences were immense. The Allied victory secured the Middle East from Axis influence for the rest of the war. More importantly, it shattered France's colonial authority in the region. To win local support during the invasion, the Free French had promised independence to Syria and Lebanon. After the fighting, they were slow to make good on that promise, but the genie was out of the bottle. The campaign had demonstrated that French rule was not invincible. Syrian and Lebanese nationalists were emboldened. In 1943, both nations declared independence, and by 1946, all French troops were gone. The borders of modern, independent Syria and Lebanon were a direct result of this messy, forgotten campaign. A battle that included a skirmish on a tennis court ended 25 years of French mandate rule and created two new countries. The unanswered questions are profound. How close did the German regime come to establishing a permanent military presence in Syria, and what would that have meant for the war? Were there secret deals between Vichy France and Berlin about the future of the Middle East that have never been declassified? And did the deep animosity created by Frenchmen fighting Frenchmen during this campaign poison French politics for decades to come? Number 15, did a forgotten war in the Arctic circle save Finland's soul? Between September 1944 and April 1945, a strange war was fought in the desolate, frozen north of Finland. The Lapland War is almost completely unknown outside of Scandinavia. It had no famous generals or massive tank battles. But it was a brutal conflict that confirmed Finland's independence and solidified its post-war borders. Finland's position in the Second World War was unique and tragic. Attacked by the Soviet Union in 1939 in the Winter War, they fought back fiercely but lost significant territory. Seeking to regain that land, they allied themselves with the German government for the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. They were not a typical Axis power. They called their fight the Continuation War and maintained a separate command. But by 1944, it was clear Germany was losing. Finland had to get out of the war. They signed a separate armistice with the Soviet Union in September 1944. The terms were harsh. They had to cede even more territory, pay massive reparations, and most humiliatingly, they were required to expel all German troops from their soil. At that moment, around 200,000 well-equipped German soldiers of the 20th Mountain Army were stationed in northern Finland in the province of Lapland. The Germans had been Finland's allies just days before. Now, they were the enemy. The German commander, General Lothar Rendulic, had planned for this possibility. He initiated a fighting withdrawal, Operation Birch, aiming to evacuate his forces north into occupied Norway. The Finns, under pressure from the Soviets who were monitoring the armistice, were forced to attack their former comrades in arms. The resulting Lapland War was a miserable affair. The Finnish army, led by General Hjalmar Silasvuo, was demobilizing most of its soldiers as part of the armistice, so they had to fight with a reduced force. The Germans, while retreating, were determined to make it costly. As they pulled back, they enacted a scorched earth policy. They destroyed everything. Roads, bridges, villages, and entire towns were burned to the ground. The city of Rovaniemi was almost completely leveled. The goal was to hamper the Finnish pursuit and leave nothing of value. The fighting was sporadic but vicious. The vast, empty wilderness of Lapland, with its swamps and forests, made conventional warfare difficult. The Finns, masters of this terrain, used ski troops and guerrilla tactics to harass the retreating German columns. The Battle of Tornio in early October 1944 was one of the key engagements where Finnish troops made a daring amphibious landing behind German lines, forcing a major retreat. By April 1945, the last German soldier had been pushed out of Finland into Norway. The war cost Finland about 1,000 dead soldiers. The Germans lost a similar number. The real cost was the devastation of Lapland, which left tens of thousands of people homeless. This forgotten war was absolutely crucial for Finland's future. By actively fighting and expelling the German forces, Finland proved to the Allies, and especially to the Soviet Union, that it had truly broken with its former ally. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a real bloody conflict. According to historian Linda Henrik O in his book Finland's War of Choice, this act of self-liberation was a key factor in why Finland, unlike so many other Eastern European nations, was not occupied by the Soviet Union and did not become a communist satellite state. The Lapland War allowed Finland to maintain its sovereignty and its democratic government, even as it had to navigate a delicate political relationship with its powerful Soviet neighbor. It confirmed the harsh borders imposed by the armistice, but saved the nation itself. Many questions about this strange war remain. Were there secret agreements between Finnish and German officers to stage a funny war at first, to allow an orderly German withdrawal? How much pressure did the Soviet Union apply behind the scenes to force the Finns into more aggressive action? And did the scorched earth policy in Lapland leave a psychological scar on the Finnish people that influenced their post-war neutrality and their relationship with Germany? Number 14. What if a rebellion in a small country shortened the war for everyone? The Slovak National Uprising of late 1944 is a story of incredible bravery and tragic failure. It is barely a footnote in most Western histories of the war, but for the people of Czechoslovakia it was a defining moment. The uprising failed to achieve its military goals, but its political consequences were enormous, directly leading to the recreation of a nation and the drawing of its post-war borders. Since 1939, Slovakia had been a separate state, a puppet republic loyal to the German government. It was run by a clerical fascist regime under Joseph Tiso. However, many Slovaks despised the regime and yearned for the restoration of the democratic Czechoslovak Republic that had been dismantled in 1938 to 39. As the Red Army pushed relentlessly westwards across Eastern Europe in 1944, dissident elements within the Slovak army and government began to plan. The plan was ambitious. 2 Slovak army divisions stationed in eastern Slovakia were supposed to secure the vital Dukla Pass through the Carpathian Mountains. They would then link up with the advancing Soviet forces, allowing the Red Army to pour into the Slovak heartland. The uprising was scheduled to begin on August 29, 1944. Things went wrong from the start. German intelligence got wind of the plot, and German troops began to occupy Slovakia to disarm the suspect army units. This forced the rebels' hand, and the uprising began prematurely. The 2 divisions in the east were quickly disarmed by the Germans, so the crucial plan to open the mountain passes failed on day 1. Despite this catastrophic setback, the rebellion took hold in central Slovakia. Rebel soldiers, joined by partisans and allied special forces teams, dropped into the region, established a liberated territory with its capital in the city of Banska Bystrica. For 2 months, this small, isolated pocket of resistance held out against overwhelming German power. They had their own air force flying from a makeshift airfield, and they fought with a courage born of desperation. The German response was ruthless. They brought in elite units, including the notorious SS Dirlewanger Brigade, a unit composed of criminals and convicts known for their extreme brutality. The German forces slowly crushed the uprising. They methodically took town after town. The fighting was savage. The book The Triumphant and the Tragic: A History of the Slovak National Uprising by John Renan gives a harrowing account of the reprisals against civilians. By the end of October, Banska Bystrica had fallen. The remaining rebels retreated into the mountains to wage a guerrilla war through the harsh winter. Militarily, the uprising was a failure. It did not significantly speed up the Soviet advance. It cost the lives of an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 rebels and civilians. But politically, it was a stunning success. The uprising completely discredited the collaborationist Tiso regime. It proved to the world and to the other Allied powers that the Slovak people did not support their puppet government. They had risen up and fought to restore Czechoslovakia. This was crucial at the post-war negotiating table. The Slovak national uprising was the single most important argument for recreating the nation of Czechoslovakia with its pre-1938 borders, with the exception of some territory annexed by the USSR. Without the uprising, it is possible the Allies might have considered leaving Slovakia as a separate, albeit neutral, state. The bloodshed by the rebels in the mountains of central Slovakia erased the puppet republic from the map and redrew the border of a reborn Czechoslovakia. The mysteries surrounding the uprising are still debated. Did Soviet political aims play a role in the failure to relieve the rebels more quickly, wanting a communist-led resistance to emerge as the dominant force? How much did internal rivalries between different factions of the Slovak resistance contribute to the initial chaos? And are there still undiscovered mass graves in the Slovak mountains hiding the true extent of the atrocities committed during the German suppression? Number 13. Why did one muddy river decide the fate of Europe? In the autumn of 1944, the Allies were on a roll. They had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were charging across France and Belgium. It looked like the war might be over by Christmas, but then everything ground to a halt. The reason was simple: supplies. The Allied armies had outrun their supply lines, which still stretched all the way back to the Normandy beaches. They needed a major deep water port, and they needed it fast. They had captured the perfect port, Antwerp, one of the largest in the world. But there was a massive problem. Antwerp is located 80 kilometers inland, connected to the North Sea by the deep but narrow Scheldt estuary. And the German 15th Army still controlled the banks of the Scheldt. The port was secure, but it was useless. Not a single supply ship could reach it. The task of clearing the Scheldt was given to the 1st Canadian Army, a multinational force that also included British, Polish, and other Allied troops. The battle that followed from early October to November 8, 1944, was one of the most difficult and miserable of the entire war. It is almost completely overshadowed by the D-Day landings and the Battle of the Bulge, but it was arguably more important for the final Allied victory. The terrain was a nightmare. Much of the land was flat, treeless polder, reclaimed from the sea and below sea level. The Germans, understanding its strategic value, had heavily fortified the area, and they had opened the dikes, flooding huge swathes of the landscape. The Canadians found themselves fighting in a landscape of mud, water, and shattered dikes. The fighting was often compared to the worst trench warfare of the First World War. The battle had several phases. The first was clearing the area north of Antwerp, known as the Breskens Pocket. This involved frontal assaults across canals and flooded fields against determined German paratroopers. The second phase was the battle for the South Beveland Peninsula. The third and most brutal was the fight for Walcheren Island, a heavily fortified island fortress that commanded the mouth of the estuary. The assault on Walcheren Island was a masterpiece of combined operations, but at a terrible cost. British commandos landed from the sea while Canadian troops advanced along a narrow, exposed causeway that was the only land link to the island. This causeway, a raised road just a few meters wide, became a death trap, a shooting gallery for German machine guns and mortars. The fighting there was so horrific it was known as the Switchback. The battle for the Scheldt cost the Allies nearly 13,000 casualties, half of them Canadian. It was a terrible price to pay for a muddy, flooded estuary. The Canadian historian C.P. Stacey, in the official history of the Canadian Army, called it one of the grimmest and bloodiest campaigns fought by Canadian soldiers. But its importance cannot be overstated. On November 28th, the first Allied supply convoy sailed up the cleared Scheldt and docked in Antwerp. The logistical bottleneck was broken. Supplies began to pour into the front lines, re-equipping the Allied armies for the final push into Germany. Without the opening of Antwerp, the Allied advance would have remained stalled. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, might have been far more successful against a poorly supplied Allied force. The war in Europe would have certainly dragged on for months longer, perhaps into the summer of 1945. This is where the battle reshaped borders. A longer war would have meant the Red Army, advancing from the east, would have pushed much deeper into Central Europe. The final meeting point between Western and Soviet forces might have been on the Rhine, not the Elbe. The post-war map of Germany, the very line that became the Iron Curtain, was drawn in part by the success of the Canadian soldiers fighting in the mud of the Scheldt. A quicker end to the war in the West secured a larger portion of Germany under Western Allied control, directly shaping the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. The key questions about the battle still linger. Why did Allied High Command, particularly General Montgomery, prioritize the ambitious but failed Operation Market Garden over the essential task of clearing the Scheldt? How many thousands of lives were lost because of this strategic error? Were German defenders on Walcheren Island close to surrendering before the final, bloody amphibious assault was launched? And what role did the local Dutch resistance play in providing intelligence that has been overlooked by official histories? Number 12. How did a fight for a single Burmese town save an empire? In early 1944, the fate of Asia hung in the balance on a remote jungle-covered frontier between India and Burma. The twin battles of Kohima and Imphal are often called the Stalingrad of the East. They're little known in the West, but they represented the high water mark of the Japanese Empire and the turning point of the war in Asia. Their outcome prevented a catastrophic redrawing of the map of South Asia. The Japanese plan, codenamed U-Go, was audacious. They intended to launch a preemptive strike from Burma into British India. Their goal was to capture the key city of Imphal and the strategic ridge at Kohima. This would not only destroy the British forces gathering for a counterattack into Burma, but it would also, they hoped, trigger a general uprising against British rule across India. If successful, it could have knocked the British Empire out of the war in Asia and changed the continent forever. The Japanese 15th Army, under the command of the aggressive and gambling Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, launched its offensive in March 1944. They achieved complete strategic surprise. They crossed the Chindwin River, bypassed British forward positions, and surged into the mountains of India. They quickly surrounded the main British Indian force in the Imphal Plain and sent a separate division to seize the vital ridge at Kohima, which controlled the only road to Imphal. The battle for Kohima became an epic of defensive warfare. A small garrison of around 2,500 British and Indian troops was all that stood in the way of the Japanese 31st Division, which numbered over 15,000 men. The fighting was centered on a small hill, the site of the local deputy commissioner's bungalow and its tennis court. For 2 weeks, defenders held on against impossible odds. The fighting was hand-to-hand, a desperate struggle for every trench and bunker. The battle lines were so close that at one point, the opposing sides were dug in on opposite sides of the tennis court, lobbing grenades at each other over the net. The battle is often called the Battle of the Tennis Court for this reason. Meanwhile, in Imphal, the surrounded British Indian IV Corps was supplied entirely by air, a massive logistical feat. They held their defensive positions, beating back wave after wave of Japanese attacks. The turning point came when British reinforcements broke through and relieved the exhausted defenders of Kohima in mid-April. From then on, the tide turned. The Japanese army had gambled everything on a quick victory. They had advanced with minimal supplies, expecting to capture British supply dumps. As the battle dragged on and the monsoon rains began, their logistical situation collapsed. Starvation and disease became as deadly as British bullets. The book, Japan's Last Bid for Victory, The Invasion of India, 1944 by Robert Lyman, paints a horrifying picture of the Japanese retreat. It was a death march. Of the 85,000 men who began the U-Go offensive, over 53,000 became casualties, most dying from starvation or disease. It was the greatest land defeat in the history of the Japanese army. The victory at Kohima and Imphal was crucial. It saved India from invasion and potential collapse. A Japanese victory could have had incalculable consequences. It might have sparked widespread rebellion, shattered the British Indian Army, and forced a British withdrawal from the subcontinent. The border of the Japanese Empire would have been extended to the heart of India. The battle's outcome ensured that the post-war decolonization of India happened on British and Indian terms, not as a consequence of Japanese conquest. It led to the creation of an independent India and Pakistan in 1947 along lines determined by the departing British, not a map redrawn by an occupying army. The battle preserved the integrity of British India long enough for it to be partitioned in a tragically violent but structured way. The modern borders of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar are all a direct legacy of the victory at Kohima and Imphal. Disturbing questions remain. How much did the Japanese High Command know about the suicidal lack of supplies for the Yugo offensive, and did they sacrifice an entire army for a reckless gamble? What was the true extent of collaboration between Indian nationalist factions and the invading Japanese forces? And are there still undiscovered diaries and letters from Japanese soldiers that could reveal the true horror of their retreat through the jungle? Number 11. Could one mountain pass have changed the political map of Central Europe? The Battle of the Dukla Pass, fought in September and October 1944, is one of the bloodiest and most forgotten battles of the Eastern Front. It was a brutal head-on collision in the Carpathian Mountains, fought in terrible weather and at a horrific cost. The battle was a direct consequence of the Slovak national uprising, and its outcome played a key role in the post-war re-establishment of Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union's annexation of a key piece of its territory. When the Slovak national uprising erupted in late August 1944, the rebels desperately needed help. They begged the advancing Soviet forces to break through the Carpathian Mountains and link up with them. The main route was the Dukla Pass, on the border of Poland and Slovakia. The Soviet High Command, under pressure to support the uprising and for political reasons of its own, ordered an immediate offensive. The plan was for the Soviet 38th Army, along with the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, composed of Czech and Slovak soldiers who had fled their homeland to fight with the Red Army, to smash through the German and Hungarian defenses at the pass and reach the Slovak city of Prešov, about 50 kilometers away, in 5 days. It was a wildly optimistic plan. The Carpathian Mountains were a natural fortress. The German defenders had spent months preparing a formidable defensive line, the Karpatenfestung, or Carpathian Fortress. They held the high ground, with interlocking fields of fire from machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The offensive began on September 8, 1944. From the very first day, it was a slaughter. Soviet and Czechoslovak troops had to advance up steep wooded slopes against an entrenched enemy. The weather was abysmal, with constant rain and fog that grounded the Soviet Air Force. German artillery was zeroed in on every road and approach. Air tanks were of limited use in the rugged terrain. It became a pure infantry battle, a meat grinder of attrition. The fighting for key hills, like the infamous Hill 534, went on for weeks, with positions changing hands multiple times a day. The book The Liberators, a story of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, by V.S. Teslenko, describes the incredible bravery and desperation of the Czechoslovak soldiers. For them, this was not just another battle, it was the fight to go home. They were trying to liberate their own country. Their casualty rates were astronomical. By the time the Soviets and Czechoslovaks finally broke through the main defensive lines and captured the pass in early October, the Slovak national uprising had already been crushed. The offensive had failed in its primary strategic goal. The fighting continued as they pushed slowly into Slovakia, but the cost was staggering. The 6-week battle for the Dukla Pass and the subsequent fighting in Slovakia cost the Soviet and Czechoslovak forces an estimated 85,000 casualties. The German and Hungarian defenders lost around 50,000. It was one of the most concentrated bloodbaths on the entire Eastern Front. So, why was this tactical failure so crucial? It was about politics and borders. The immense sacrifice of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps at Dukla cemented their legitimacy and the legitimacy of the Czechoslovak government in exile in London. It was proof paid in blood of Czechoslovakia's contribution to the Allied victory. This, along with the Slovak uprising, ensured the country would be restored after the war. But the battle also had a more direct impact on the map. The region just to the east of the Dukla Pass was Carpatho-Ukraine, or Subcarpathian Rus', which had been the easternmost province of pre-war Czechoslovakia. As Soviet forces liberated this territory during the offensive, Soviet political agents moved in right behind them. They organized local committees that requested to join the Soviet Union. The Czechoslovak government was in no position to argue. In 1945, Czechoslovakia was forced to formally cede the entire province to the Soviet Union. The Red Army's presence, established during the Dukla Pass offensive, made the annexation a foregone conclusion. The modern border between Ukraine and Slovakia was drawn by the path of the Soviet advance through the Carpathians in 1944. The unanswered questions are chilling. Did the Soviet command deliberately sacrifice the Czechoslovak Corps in the worst parts of the fighting for political reasons to weaken any potential post-war nationalist sentiment. How much did the failure to relieve the Slovak uprising in time stem from military incompetence versus a cynical political desire to let non-communist rebels be destroyed? And what pressure was applied to the Czechoslovak government to force them to give up Carpatho-Ukraine, a story whose full details may still be buried in closed Moscow archives. Number 10. Where did the Second World War really begin? We are taught that the Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, when German forces invaded Poland. But for the people of Poland, the end of their nation came from two directions. The lesser-known part of that story is the Soviet invasion from the east, and the Battle of Lwów is a perfect microcosm of that national tragedy, a fight that led directly to the partition of Poland and the shifting of borders that would define Eastern Europe for the next 50 years. When the German invasion began, the Polish army put up a fierce, but ultimately doomed, resistance. They fought alone, as their British and French allies offered no direct military assistance. The Polish high command planned to fall back to the southeast, to an area known as the Romanian Bridgehead. There they hoped to establish a defensive line, hold out through the winter, and wait for a promised Allied offensive in the west. The city of Lwów, now Lviv in Ukraine, was the key to this strategy. It was a major cultural and military center. German forces reached the outskirts of Lwów by September 12th and began to lay siege to the city. The Polish garrison, commanded by General Ladisław Langer, put up a spirited defense. For a week, they held off repeated German assaults. The fighting was intense, with Polish soldiers and civilian volunteers defending their city street by street. Then, on September 17th, everything changed. The Soviet Union, citing the collapse of the Polish state and the need to protect its Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities, invaded Poland from the east. This was a direct result of a secret protocol in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression treaty signed between the two powers in August 1939. In reality, it was a coordinated plan to destroy and partition Poland. The Red Army advanced rapidly, meeting little organized resistance, as most of the Polish army was engaged with the Germans in the west. By September 19th, Soviet forces had reached the outskirts of Lwów, coming face to face with the besieging German army. For a few strange days, the city was surrounded by two different, supposedly hostile armies, both of whom were attacking the same Polish defenders. There were even instances of cooperation, with German artillery supporting Soviet attacks. General Langer was now in an impossible position. He was trapped between two enemies. Fighting on was hopeless. He decided to negotiate a surrender. He chose to surrender to the Soviets, believing naively that they would be a less hostile occupying power than the Germans. On September 22nd, the Polish garrison of Lwów surrendered to the Red Army. The Soviets had agreed to allow the Polish soldiers to march out and go to neutral Romania. It was a lie. As soon as they had laid down their arms, the Polish officers were arrested by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Many of them would later be murdered in the Katyn Forest massacre. The joint capture of Lwów was the symbolic and practical culmination of the dual invasion. It sealed the fate of Poland. The country was carved up between the two totalitarian powers along a pre-agreed line. This act of aggression directly reshaped the map of Europe. The eastern half of Poland, including the city of Lwów, was absorbed into the Soviet Union, incorporated into the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet Socialist republics. This new border, drawn in 1939, largely persisted after the war. While Poland was shifted westwards at the expense of Germany, it never regained its eastern territories. The city of Lwów, a center of Polish culture for centuries, became the Ukrainian city of Lviv. The Battle of Lwów was not just another siege, it was the moment when a secret pact became a brutal reality, wiping a nation off the map and creating a new border that would last for generations. The current eastern border of Poland is a direct legacy of this two-front invasion. We are still left with haunting questions. What was the full extent of military coordination between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army during the invasion of Poland? Are there German or Soviet records of joint staff meetings that have never come to light? How many Polish officers who surrendered at Lwów were individually tracked and executed by the NKVD? And do their files still exist in Moscow? And did the Polish commander have any inkling of the fate that awaited his men when he chose to surrender to the Soviets? Number 9. What if a forgotten resistance movement defined the soul of a nation? The Battle of Vercors Plateau in the summer of 1944 is a story of hope, betrayal, and ultimate sacrifice. It was the largest single action undertaken by the French resistance during the war, and its brutal suppression was a military disaster. Yet this defeat was crucial in forging the post-war identity of France and reaffirming its sovereignty over its pre-war borders. The Vercors is a massive fortress-like limestone plateau in the foothills of the French Alps. Its rugged terrain, with sheer cliffs and limited access points, made it a natural redoubt. Since 1943, local resistance fighters, known as the Maquis, had been using it as a base. With the D-Day landings in June 1944, the leaders of the Vercors Maquis decided to make a bold move. They believed they could turn the plateau into a major operational base for the Allies. They declared the Free Republic of the Vercors on July 3, 1944. They raised the French flag, openly defied the German occupation and the collaborationist Vichy regime, and called for Allied support. They expected massive airdrops of heavy weapons and, eventually, the landing of Allied airborne troops. It saw themselves as creating a liberated piece of French territory, a symbol of national resurgence. For a few weeks it worked. The Free Republic of the Vercors became a beacon of hope for occupied France. Around 4,000 fighters flocked to the plateau. The German response was slow at first, but when it came, it was overwhelming and merciless. On July 21st, the Germans launched Operation Bettina. Elite mountain troops assaulted the passes leading up to the plateau. But the most shocking element was the landing of SS glider troops directly onto the plateau's surface, something the Maquis had believed impossible. The lightly armed resistance fighters were no match for heavily armed, battle-hardened German soldiers. The battle turned into a massacre. The Maquis were scattered and hunted down. The German troops, particularly the SS units, engaged in horrific reprisals against the fighters and the civilian population of the Vercors. The village of Vassieux-en-Vercors, where the gliders had landed, was completely destroyed, and its inhabitants murdered. The resistance fighters who were captured were tortured and executed. By the end of August, the Free Republic of the Vercors had been utterly crushed. Over 600 resistance fighters and 200 civilians were killed. The Allied support the Maquis had begged for never arrived on the scale they needed. The strategic focus was on the battle for Normandy, hundreds of miles away. Only a few small supply drops were made. The Vercors was a tragic sideshow in the grand scheme of Allied strategy. So how could such a devastating defeat be crucial? Its importance was political and symbolic. The story of the Vercors, as detailed in works like Vercors, The French Resistance, and The Triumph of Tragedy by Paddy Ashdown, became a founding myth of post-war France. It was the ultimate proof that the French people had not all collaborated. They had fought back, they had liberated a piece of their own soil, however briefly. This narrative was vital for Charles de Gaulle and the Free French government. It allowed them to assert that France was not a defeated and occupied nation to be administered by the Allies, but a victorious power that had liberated itself. This was crucial for the restoration of France's borders and its status as a great power. The sacrifice of the Vercors Maquis helped justify France's claim to its pre-war territory, including the contentious regions of Alsace and Lorraine. It also helped secure France a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. The battle was a military failure, but a political triumph. It helped cleanse the stain of the 1940 defeat and the collaboration of the Vichy regime, restoring the nation's honor and its place on the world map. The controversy and mystery of the Vercors endure. Was the uprising a reckless act of bravado encouraged by unrealistic promises from Allied agents on the ground? How much did Charles de Gaulle's political rivalry with other resistance leaders influence the decision-making process and the lack of support? And are there still classified Allied documents that reveal the true reasons why the Vercors fighters were, in the eyes of many, abandoned to their fate? Number 8. What if Greece had surrendered in 1940? In the autumn of 1940, the Axis powers seemed invincible. Most of Europe was under their control. Great Britain stood alone. Then, on October 28th, the Italian leader, Benito Mussolini, seeking to match his German allies' successes, launched an invasion of Greece from neighboring Albania. He expected a swift victory, a military parade through Athens within weeks. Instead, he got a humiliating defeat that had massive, unforeseen consequences for the entire war. The key battles of the Greco-Italian War were fought in the rugged Pindus Mountains on the Albanian border. The Battle of Elaia was one of the crucial early engagements. The Italian plan was to have their forces in the Epirus sector break through the Greek defenses at Elaia and drive south, cutting off and encircling the main Greek army. The Greek army was small and poorly equipped compared to the Italians, but they had several advantages. They were defending their homeland, they were masters of the mountainous terrain, and their commander, Alexandros Papagos, was a brilliant strategist. The Greek soldiers, known as Evzones, fought with incredible tenacity. At Elaia the Greek defenders held their ground against superior Italian numbers and equipment. The Italian advance bogged down in the mud and mountains. The Greek defensive line held. And then, the Greeks did the unthinkable, they counterattacked. All along the front, the Greek army pushed the Italians back. They not only repelled the invasion, but advanced deep into Albania, capturing several cities. It was the first major land victory for any allied nation in the war. The world was stunned. The myth of Axis invincibility was shattered. The victory came at a great cost in Greek lives, but its strategic importance was immense. As historian John Keegan notes in his The Second World War, the Greek victory was a huge morale boost for the struggling allies. But its most crucial impact was on Adolf Hitler's timetable. The Italian debacle in Greece was a major embarrassment. Hitler was forced to divert German forces to bail out his incompetent ally. In April 1941, Germany launched its own invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. The German invasion, Operation Merito, was successful. The Greeks, exhausted from 6 months of fighting and now facing the might of the German army, were overwhelmed. Greece was occupied, but the fight had been costly for the Germans, and most importantly, it had caused a critical delay. The forces and, crucially, the time used to conquer the Balkans had been earmarked for the main event of Hitler's war, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. Originally planned for mid-May, Operation Barbarossa was delayed by 5 to 6 weeks because of the Balkan campaign. The German invasion of the Soviet Union did not begin until June 22, 1941. Those 5 weeks were vital. When the German advance finally ground to a halt in December 1941, its forward units were bogged down in the snow and ice of the brutal Russian winter, just a few miles from the gates of Moscow. Many historians, including Andrew Roberts, argue that this delay, caused by the need to invade Greece, was one of the single most important factors in Germany's ultimate failure to defeat the Soviet Union. If Barbarossa had started in May, Moscow might have fallen before the winter set in. The Greek resistance in 1940, therefore, had a direct impact on the outcome of the entire war. By preventing an Italian conquest, Greece maintained its national sovereignty, which was restored after the war. The battle reshaped borders by preventing an Italian annexation of Greek territory and by contributing to the eventual Allied victory that would see the borders of Eastern Europe completely redrawn. The fierce no-ohi that the Greeks delivered to the Italian ultimatum in 1940 echoed across the continent, delaying a tyrant's timetable and perhaps saving the world. The unanswered questions are fascinating. How much did Mussolini's personal jealousy of Hitler's success drive the decision to invade Greece against the advice of his own generals? Were there secret British plans to establish a major military front in Greece that were thwarted by the speed of the German invasion? And what if the Greek army had been better equipped by the Allies in the winter of 1940? Could they have driven the Italians out of Albania completely and changed the entire strategic picture in the Mediterranean? Number 7. How did a battle in Norway secure the war's most vital resource? The battles of Narvik, fought on land and sea in the spring of 1940, were the first major confrontation between Allied and German forces in the Second World War. This brutal fight in the fjords and mountains of the Arctic Circle is often overlooked, but it was a battle for the single most important resource of the industrial war, iron ore. Its outcome had direct consequences for the length of the war and the post-war fate of Norway. Why Narvik? This small, ice-free port high above the Arctic Circle was the crucial outlet for high-grade iron ore from the mines of northern Sweden. During the winter, when the Baltic Sea froze, almost all of Sweden's iron ore exports had to travel by rail to Narvik and then be shipped down the coast of Norway. This ore was the lifeblood of the German war machine. Without it, their production of tanks, ships, and guns would grind to a halt. The Allies knew this, and so did the Germans. In early April 1940, both sides made their move on neutral Norway. The Germans got there first. On April 9th, as part of their surprise invasion of Denmark and Norway Operation Weserübung, 10 German destroyers carrying 2,000 mountain troops slipped up the long Ofotfjord and seized Narvik. It was a bold and risky operation. The British Royal Navy responded immediately. In 2 separate naval battles inside the narrow fjord, on April 10th and 13th, a British fleet completely annihilated the German destroyer force. It was a stunning naval victory. The 2,000 German soldiers were now stranded 1,000 miles from home without naval support or any hope of reinforcement by sea. This set the stage for the land battle. An Allied expeditionary force composed of British, French, Polish, and Norwegian troops was landed in the area. Over the next 6 weeks, in brutal Arctic conditions, they fought to retake Narvik. The fighting was fierce, with soldiers battling not just the enemy but also deep snow, avalanches, and freezing temperatures. The Polish Independent Highland Brigade and the French Foreign Legion particularly distinguished themselves in the mountain fighting. On May 28th, the Allies finally recaptured the town of Narvik. It was the first significant land victory for the Allies in the war. The German commander Eduard Dietl and his remaining troops were pushed back towards the Swedish border and were on the verge of collapse. But then, disaster struck elsewhere. The German blitzkrieg in France was unfolding with stunning speed. The British and French armies were on the verge of collapse. The Allies desperately needed their troops from Norway to defend the homeland. In a heartbreaking decision, just as victory was in their grasp, the order was given to evacuate. By June 8th, all Allied troops had been withdrawn from Narvik. The Norwegian forces were forced to surrender, and the Germans reoccupied the town. It was a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat for the Germans. They secured their vital iron ore route for the rest of the war. This was crucial. It allowed German industry to continue producing at full capacity, prolonging the war by years. A decisive Allied victory at Narvik in 1940 could have choked the German war economy and perhaps shortened the conflict significantly. The battle also sealed Norway's fate. The German occupation would last for 5 long years. This had a profound impact on Norway's post-war identity and foreign policy. Having been invaded and occupied, neutral Norway abandoned its traditional neutrality after the war. It became a founding member of NATO in 1949, firmly anchoring itself in the Western Alliance. Its long border with the Soviet Union became a sensitive Cold War frontier. The battle for a remote Arctic port in 1940 directly led to the redrawing of the political, if not the physical, map of Scandinavia for the next half-century. Many questions about Narvik remain. How close did the German forces under Dietl come to surrendering or crossing into Sweden to be interned? What was the true nature of the disagreements between the British, French, and Norwegian commanders that hampered the Allied campaign? And did Swedish intelligence play a secret role in providing information to either side about the all-important iron ore shipments? Number 6. What if the Red Army had been destroyed in the spring of 1942? In May 1942, the world was focused on the Eastern Front. A year earlier, the German invasion of the Soviet Union had come within sight of Moscow before being stopped by the winter. Now, with the spring thaw, everyone was waiting for the next German summer offensive, but Stalin decided to strike first. He planned a massive pincer attack to recapture the city of Kharkov in Ukraine. A key part of this plan was a supporting attack from the Kerch Peninsula in the Crimea. The catastrophic failure of that operation, the Battle of the Kerch Peninsula, is a little-known disaster that almost lost the war for the Soviet Union and would have completely changed the map of Eastern Europe. The Soviets had landed on the Kerch Peninsula in December 1941, establishing a precarious beachhead. By May 1942, they had built up a force of 3 armies, over 250,000 men, and hundreds of tanks. They massively outnumbered the German and Romanian forces of the German 11th Army, commanded by the brilliant Erich von Manstein. But the Soviet command was abysmal. The front was commanded by a political crony of Stalin's, Lev Meklis, a man with no real military talent. The Soviet forces were poorly organized, crammed into a narrow front with their backs to the sea. Manstein saw his opportunity. On May 8th, he launched his own preemptive attack, codenamed Operation Trappenjag Bustard Hunt. The German plan was a masterpiece of deception and speed. They launched a heavy diversionary attack in the north, drawing the Soviet reserves. Then they unleashed their main armored thrust in the south, shattering the Soviet lines. The German panzers raced across the flat terrain, cutting off the Soviet armies from their supply lines and escape routes. The Soviet command structure collapsed into chaos. Meklis and the other generals lost control of their troops. What followed was a rout. The vast Soviet force was trapped against the Strait of Kerch. German aircraft, unopposed in the sky, bombed and strafed the retreating columns. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were driven into the sea, where they drowned trying to escape. In just over a week, the battle was over. It was one of the most one-sided victories of the war. The Soviets lost over 176,000 men killed or captured, along with all their heavy equipment. The Germans suffered fewer than 8,000 casualties. A small remnant of Soviet soldiers held out for months in the catacombs of the Adzimushke Quarry, a separate tragic story of resistance. The consequences of this disaster were immediate and catastrophic for the Soviet Union. With the Kerch front eliminated, Manstein was free to turn his full attention to the great naval fortress of Sevastopol, which he captured a few weeks later. This secured the entire Crimea for the Germans. More importantly, the destruction of the Soviet armies at Kerch completely uncovered the southern flank of the main Soviet front. This allowed Hitler to launch his May 1942 summer offensive, Case Blue, with an entirely secure southern flank. German armies poured eastwards, completely unopposed in the south. One group drove towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. The German Sixth Army drove towards a city on the Volga River called Stalingrad. The disaster at Kerch directly enabled the German advance to Stalingrad and the Caucasus. It brought the Soviet Union to the very brink of collapse in the summer and autumn of 1942. If Stalingrad had fallen, a very real possibility, the Soviet Union may well have been defeated. The battle, therefore, had a profound, if indirect, impact on post-war borders. A German victory in the East would have led to a complete dismemberment of the Soviet Union and the creation of German-controlled puppet states, a terrifying redrawing of the world map. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad reversed this, but the near disaster was rooted in the forgotten defeat at Kerch. The eventual reconquest of the Crimea by the Red Army in 1944 was also a direct consequence, leading to the brutal deportation of the entire Crimean Tatar population, an act of ethnic cleansing that still poisons the region's politics today. The struggle for the Crimea in 1942 was a pivotal moment that determined the future shape of Ukraine and Russia. The most disturbing questions are about the Soviet leadership. How much did Stalin's paranoia and his reliance on incompetent political commissars like Meklis contribute to one of the Red Army's greatest defeats? Are there records of frantic, last-minute messages from the front pleading with Stalin to allow a withdrawal, messages that were ignored? And what was the full story of the soldiers trapped in the Ajimushke quarry? Did the Soviet command make any serious attempt to rescue them, or were they simply written off as a lost cause? Number 5. How did the Soviets win the war against Japan without the bomb? When we think of the end of the war in the Pacific, we think of two events: the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But what if there was another event happening at the exact same time that was arguably more decisive in compelling Japan's surrender? That event was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, codenamed Operation August Storm. It was one of the most successful and most overlooked military operations of the 20th century, and it completely reshaped the map of Northeast Asia. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. He kept his word. On August 9th, 1945, just hours after the bombing of Nagasaki, over 1.5 million Soviet troops, supported by 5,000 tanks and 3,000 aircraft, surged across the border into Japanese-occupied Manchuria, which the Japanese called Manchukuo. The Japanese Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, was a hollow shell of its former self. Its best units had been stripped away to fight in the Pacific. It was a large force on paper, around 700,000 men, but it was composed mostly of raw recruits, reservists, and poorly equipped units. It was no match for the battle-hardened Red Army veterans who had just finished crushing the German army in Europe. The Soviet plan, developed by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, was a classic double envelopment, a huge-scale pincer movement. Soviet forces attacked from the west, north, and east. The western pincer, commanded by Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, had the most difficult task crossing the formidable Gobi Desert and the greater Khingan mountain range. The Japanese believed this was impossible for a large mechanized army. They were wrong. The Soviet armored columns achieved complete surprise, appearing deep in the Manchurian plains where they were least expected. The result was a blitzkrieg that dwarfed anything seen in Europe. The Kwantung Army simply disintegrated. In less than 2 weeks, the Red Army advanced hundreds of kilometers, captured the major cities of Manchuria, and destroyed the Japanese ability to resist. The Soviets also invaded Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands. By the time Japan officially surrendered on August 15th, the Soviet operation was largely complete. The Kwantung Army had suffered an estimated 84,000 killed and nearly 600,000 captured. The Soviets lost around 12,000 killed. Historians like Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, in his book Racing the Enemy, argue persuasively that the Soviet invasion was the final, decisive shock that forced the Japanese government to surrender. The atomic bombs were horrific, but some in the Japanese military believed they could endure them and fight a final, apocalyptic battle on the home islands. The swift and total destruction of the Kwantung Army, however, was a military reality they could not ignore. It eliminated any hope of using Manchuria as a final bastion or of negotiating a conditional surrender with the Soviets as intermediaries. The geopolitical consequences were immense and immediate. The Soviet occupation of Manchuria allowed them to dismantle its industrial base and ship it back to the USSR as war reparations. More importantly, they turned over captured Japanese weapons and territory to the Chinese Communist forces led by Mao Zedong. This was a massive boost to the communists in their civil war against the nationalists, and it played a significant role in their ultimate victory in 1949 and the creation of the People's Republic of China. The operation also directly created the division of Korea. As Soviet troops swept down from the north, they halted at the 38th parallel, an arbitrary line agreed upon with the Americans for occupation zones. This temporary line became the permanent fortified border between North and South Korea, a flashpoint that led to the Korean War and remains one of the most dangerous borders in the world. And as we saw with the Battle of Shamshu, the operation resulted in the Soviet annexation of the Kuril Islands. Operation August Storm didn't just end the war, it created the political map and the major conflicts of Cold War Asia. The unresolved questions are of immense historical importance. How much did the timing of the atomic bombs influence Stalin's decision to launch the invasion precisely when he did? Was there a race between the US and the USSR to see who could deliver the final blow to Japan and claim the spoils? And what if the US had not dropped the atomic bombs? Would a prolonged Soviet invasion of Manchuria and potentially even the Japanese home island of Hokkaido have resulted in a permanently divided Japan, similar to Germany and Korea? Number 4. Did a forgotten border war in 1938 set the stage for Pearl Harbor? A year before the invasion of Poland, a short, sharp, and almost completely forgotten battle was fought on the border of Siberia and Japanese-occupied Korea. The Battle of Lake Khasan in the summer of 1938 was, on the surface, a minor border clash over a disputed hill. But it was a crucial test of strength between two rising powers, the Soviet Union and Imperial Japan, and its outcome had a profound influence on the strategic decisions that would lead to the Pacific War. The border in the region around Lake Khasan and the Tumen River was poorly defined. Both the Soviets and the Japanese claimed the strategic ridge known as Chenkufeng Hill. In July 1938, Soviet border guards occupied the hill, prompting a furious Japanese protest. The local Japanese Kwantung Army, known for its aggressive and insubordinate commanders, decided to take matters into their own hands without clear authorization from Tokyo. They launched an assault to retake the hill. The initial Japanese attacks were successful. The elite Japanese 19th Division stormed the ridge, driving off the surprised Soviet defenders. The fighting was intense, with bayonet charges and hand-to-hand combat. For a few days, it looked like a decisive Japanese victory. Tokyo was pleased, but also nervous about the clash escalating into a full-scale war with the Soviet Union. But the Soviets were not about to back down. The battle was placed under the command of a rising star in the Red Army, Georgy Zhukov, who would later become the USSR's most famous general. The Soviets brought up massive reinforcements, including heavy artillery, tanks, and aircraft. On August 6th, they unleashed a crushing counteroffensive. After days of brutal fighting, the sheer weight of Soviet firepower and numbers overwhelmed the Japanese defenders. By August 11th, the Japanese had been driven off the hill and back to their original lines. A ceasefire was arranged, and the border was restored to the line the Soviets claimed. It was a sharp, bloody, and localized defeat for the Japanese army. They had lost over 1,400 casualties. But the real impact was psychological and strategic. The Battle of Lake Khasan, though small, was the first time the Japanese army had been dealt a clear tactical defeat by a European power in modern history. It was a shock to their sense of martial superiority. More importantly, it exposed a deep rift in Japanese strategic thinking. This rift was between the Strike North faction, led by the army, which saw the Soviet Union as the main enemy and wanted to expand into Siberia, and the Strike South faction, led by the Navy, which saw the United States and the European colonial powers as the main enemy and wanted to expand into Southeast Asia to secure vital resources like oil and rubber. The defeat at Lake Khasan was a major blow to the Strike North faction. It demonstrated that the Red Army was a formidable modern force with overwhelming material superiority. Any attempt to invade Siberia would be a long, costly, and likely disastrous affair. The lesson was driven home even more brutally a year later in a much larger, but still undeclared, war at Khalkhingal. Lake Khasan was the first sign that the Soviet bear was too tough to fight. This realization was crucial. It caused Japanese strategic planners in Tokyo to seriously reevaluate their priorities. The arguments of the Strike South faction began to look much more appealing. The resources of Southeast Asia were tempting, and the European powers, distracted by the war in Europe, looked like easy targets. This strategic shift away from the north and towards the south put Japan on a direct collision course with the United States and its interests in the Pacific. The road to Pearl Harbor, in a very real sense, began with the bloody lessons learned on a forgotten hill on the Siberian border. The battle solidified the Soviet-Manchurian border, but its real impact was in turning an empire's ambition 180 degrees. The lingering questions are about intent and intelligence. Was the entire incident deliberately provoked by the Soviets to test Japanese strength and intentions? How much did the insubordination of the local Kuomintang army commanders drive the conflict against the wishes of the government in Tokyo? And what was the full extent of the purge of Soviet commanders in the Far East, which happened right before the battle, and did it almost cost the Red Army the victory? Number 3. How did a Finnish victory lead to a loss of territory? The Battle of Suomussalmi, fought in the depths of the Finnish winter between December 1939 and January 1940, is a legendary tale of David versus Goliath. It was a stunning victory for the vastly outnumbered Finnish army against the invading Soviet Red Army during the Winter War. But this incredible military success had a paradoxical and tragic outcome. It helped convince the world of Soviet military weakness, which encouraged the German invasion a year and a half later, and ultimately, it could not prevent Finland from losing a huge swathe of its territory. The Soviet plan for the invasion of Finland was to cut the country in half at its narrowest point. To do this, they sent the 163rd and later the 44th Rifle Divisions, a force of around 45,000 men with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, to advance through the dense forests near the town of Suomussalmi. They expected to reach the city of Oulu on the Gulf of Bothnia in 2 weeks. They were opposed by a tiny Finnish force, eventually numbering around 11,000 men, under the command of Colonel Halmar Silasvuo. The Finns had no tanks and very few anti-tank guns or artillery pieces. What they had was knowledge of the terrain, the ability to operate in the extreme cold, which often dropped to 40 degrees Celsius, and a tactic they called Madi. The Soviet divisions were road-bound. Their heavy equipment and vehicles could not move through the deep snow of the forests. The Finns, on skis, were mobile and elusive. They did not try to stop the Soviet columns head-on. Instead, they let them advance along the narrow forest roads and then attacked them from the flanks and rear. They blew up bridges, blocked the roads with felled trees, and attacked the Soviet field kitchens, depriving the soldiers of hot food. They cut the long Soviet columns into smaller isolated pockets, or motis. Over the course of a month, the Finns systematically destroyed these motis one by one. The surrounded Soviet soldiers, freezing, starving, and under constant attack from ghosts like Finnish ski troops, either surrendered or were annihilated. The results were staggering. The 2 Soviet divisions were completely wiped out. The Finns captured dozens of tanks, hundreds of trucks, and vast quantities of weapons and ammunition, which they desperately needed. The images of the Reshaped road, littered for miles with the frozen corpses of Soviet soldiers and the burned-out wreckage of their vehicles, became an enduring symbol of the Winter War. The victory at Suomussalmi was a military masterpiece studied in military academies to this day. It was a huge morale boost for the Finns and a source of deep humiliation for the Red Army. But it had wider, unintended consequences. While the Finns won this and other stunning tactical victories, they could not win the war. The Soviet Union had endless reserves of manpower. They eventually overwhelmed the Finnish defenses on the main front in the Karelian Isthmus. In March 1940, Finland was forced to sign the Moscow Peace Treaty. Despite their incredible battlefield successes, they had to cede 11% of their territory to the Soviet Union, including the entire Karelian Isthmus and Finland's second-largest city, Viipuri. Over 400,000 Finns, the entire population of the ceded areas, had to be evacuated and resettled. The border of Finland was drastically redrawn. Furthermore, the Red Army's pathetic performance in Finland, exemplified by the disaster at Suomussalmi, was closely watched by observers in Berlin. It reinforced the German leadership's belief that the Soviet military was a hollow, poorly led giant that would collapse after a single hard kick. This perception was a major factor in the decision to launch Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The Finnish victory, in a cruel twist of fate, may have helped precipitate a much larger and more devastating war. It saved the nation's honor but could not save its borders, and it inadvertently painted a target on its powerful, incompetent neighbor. The questions that remain are debated by historians. How much did Stalin's purges of the Red Army Officer Corps in the late 1930s contribute to the shocking incompetence displayed at Suomussalmi? Were there finished plans to try and hold the ceded territories by force, and if so, what were the chances of success? And did the captured Soviet equipment and intelligence after the battle provide the Finnish army with crucial insights that they used during the subsequent continuation war? Number 2. Could a French farmers' revolt have saved France in 1940? The Battle of Ston, fought over several days in mid-May 1940, is almost completely forgotten, lost in the whirlwind of the German blitzkrieg and the stunningly rapid fall of France. But, for a brief critical moment, this desperate fight for a tiny French village held the key to the entire campaign. It was a brutal, close-run battle that, had it gone the other way, might just have derailed the German invasion and preserved the pre-war borders of Western Europe. The main German plan for the invasion of France, the Manstein Plan, involved a massive armored thrust through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. This would bypass the main French and British armies in Belgium and burst out into their rear, trapping them against the coast. The linchpin of this entire operation was the establishment of secure bridgeheads over the Meuse River near the city of Sedan. The Germans achieved their crossing on May 13th, but their hold was tenuous. The French High Command, realizing the mortal danger, began to throw everything they had at the southern flank of the German penetration to try and cut it off. The small village of Stone, situated on a commanding hill overlooking the Meuse bridgeheads, became the focal point of these French counterattacks. The control of Stone was essential. For the Germans, it was the southern anchor of their entire invasion route. For the French, it was the springboard from which they could destroy the bridgeheads and stop the blitzkrieg dead in its tracks. What followed was one of the most intense and savage tank battles of the 1940 campaign. From May 15th to May 18th, the village of Stoney and the surrounding hills changed hands no fewer than 17 times. This was not a one-sided affair. This was German panzers versus the elite of the French armored forces, including their heavy Char B-1 BIS tanks, which were superior in armor and firepower to any German tank at the time. The fighting was at point-blank range, a brutal slugging match in the streets of the village and the surrounding woods. One French tank commander, Captain Pierre Bilot, in his Char B-1 BIS named Ure, achieved legendary status by attacking a column of German Panzer III and IV tanks, destroying 13 of them in a matter of minutes before returning to French lines unscathed. The village itself was completely destroyed, reduced to rubble. It became known as the Verdun of 1940. The Germans, particularly the Grossdeutschland Infantry Regiment and the 10th Panzer Division, were shaken by the ferocity of the French resistance. For a time, the German command, including General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Ardennes thrust, was deeply worried. The German advance to the English Channel was temporarily halted while they dealt with the threat at Stoney. The entire invasion plan hung in the balance. In the end, the French failed. They could not coordinate their attacks effectively. Their infantry and artillery support was lacking, and the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, controlled the skies, relentlessly bombing the French positions. The Germans were able to reinforce their position faster. By May 18th, they had secured Stoney for good. The French counterattack had been broken. The German panzers were unleashed to begin their famous race to the sea. The failure at Stoney was the last real chance to stop the German invasion. A French victory here would have been catastrophic for the Germans. It would have cut off their lead armored divisions from their supplies and infantry. The entire Manstein plan might have unraveled. France might not have fallen. The war would have taken a completely different course. The Battle of Stone was the turning point of the Battle of France. Its outcome led directly to the defeat of France, the German occupation, and the establishment of the Vichy regime. The post-war era, with a divided Germany and a weakened France, was a direct consequence of the failure to hold this small village. Had the battle gone the other way, the borders of 1939 might have held, and the history of the 20th century would look very different. The fight for this obscure village was a fight for the map of modern Europe. The unanswered questions are agonizing for French historians. What if the French had concentrated more of their powerful heavy tanks at Stone instead of scattering them across the front? How much did poor communication and the rigid, top-down French command structure contribute to the failure of the counterattacks? And were there moments when a single decisive push by one more French regiment could have broken the German lines and changed the course of world history? Number 1. What if the Second World War began in Asia? The Battle of Köln-Gol, or the Nomonhan Incident as it is known in Japan, was not a battle of the Second World War. It was a full-scale, undeclared war fought between the Soviet Union and Japan on the border of Mongolia and Manchuria in the summer of 1939, months before the invasion of Poland. It is arguably the most important and most ignored battle of the 20th century. Its decisive outcome not only solidified a key Asian border, but also fundamentally altered the entire strategic direction of the Axis powers, setting the stage for both Pearl Harbor and the German invasion of the USSR. The conflict, like the one at Lake Khasan a year earlier, began with a disputed border. The Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria claimed the border with the Soviet satellite state of Mongolia was the Khalkhin-Gol River. The Soviets and Mongolians claimed it was a line several miles to the east. In May 1939, a small skirmish between Mongolian and Manchurian cavalry escalated rapidly. The aggressive Kwantung Army, acting with its usual semi-independence from Tokyo, decided to teach the Soviets a lesson. Initial Japanese probes were successful. They pushed the Soviet and Mongolian forces back across the river. Emboldened, they planned a major offensive in late August to encircle and annihilate the Soviet forces. The Japanese were confident. They believed their soldiers' superior fighting spirit, the famous Yamato Damashi, would overcome the Soviets' material advantage. They had no idea who they were up against. The Soviet forces at Khalkhin-Gol had a new commander, Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov, the same man who had won at Lake Khasan, was given a free hand by Stalin. He assembled an overwhelming force, nearly 600 tanks, 500 aircraft, and over 100,000 men. He meticulously planned a classic sweeping double envelopment, a tactic he would later use to great effect at Stalingrad. On August 20th, 1939, just as the Japanese were preparing their own offensive, Zhukov struck first. The Soviet attack was a perfectly coordinated storm of artillery, air power, and armor. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Soviet tanks and motorized infantry swept around the Japanese flanks, meeting at the village of Nemonhan and trapping the entire Japanese 23rd Division. The encircled Japanese fought with suicidal bravery, but they were hopelessly outgunned. The Soviets systematically destroyed them. By August 31st, the battle was over. The Japanese had been annihilated. They suffered an estimated 18,000 casualties. Some regiments were completely wiped out. The Soviets, while suffering significant casualties themselves, had won one of the most decisive victories in modern military history. A ceasefire was signed on September 15th, just as German and Soviet forces were carving up Poland. The impact of this secret war was monumental. First, it directly settled the border dispute. The border between Mongolia and Manchuria was fixed on the line the Soviets claimed, a border that exists to this day between modern Mongolia and China. But the strategic consequences were far more profound. The catastrophic defeat at Khalkhin-Gol was a seismic shock to the Japanese government and military. It utterly discredited the Strike North faction in the army. The lesson was now burned into their consciousness. The Red Army was too powerful and technologically superior. Any invasion of Siberia was a suicidal fantasy. As a result, Japan's entire strategic orientation shifted decisively south. The Strike South faction, the Navy's plan, was now the only viable option. To secure the resources needed for its empire, Japan had to seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and the rubber and tin of Malaya. This path led directly to a confrontation with the United States Navy and the British Empire. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was a direct consequence of the thrashing they received from Zhukov's tanks on the plains of Mongolia 2 years earlier. Furthermore, this defeat led Japan to sign a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union in April 1941. This pact was a diplomatic masterstroke for Stalin. It meant that when Germany invaded the Soviet Union 2 months later, Stalin did not have to fear a second front in the Far East. He could and did transfer his elite, battle-hardened Siberian divisions from the Manchurian border to the west. These were the divisions, commanded by men who had learned modern warfare at Khalkhin-Gol, that arrived just in time to lead the counter-offensive that saved Moscow in the winter of 1941. Khalkhin-Gol was the battle that told Japan to attack America, not Russia, and it was the battle that freed up the divisions that saved Moscow. It's hard to imagine a more crucial or more overlooked engagement. It was a quiet war in a forgotten corner of Asia that shaped the destiny of the entire world. What secrets does this battle still hold? What was the true nature of the intelligence that Soviet spy Richard Sorgi was sending from Tokyo? And how much did it confirm for Stalin that Japan would not attack in 1941? Were there Kwantung Army officers who planned a renewed, unauthorized attack on the Soviets even after the defeat, a plan that was quashed by Tokyo, and how many details of Zhukov's innovative combined arms tactics, first tested at Halkyn Gol, remain unstudied in the Soviet military archives, holding lessons we have yet to learn.